This is Randall Smith, and you are listening to my lecture on corporate identity and visual systems, prepared for my Designer 2600 class, The History of Graphic Design, at the University of Utah, spring 2020. The lecture is based broadly on Chapter 20, Corporate Identity and Visual Systems, from the book Meggs, History of Graphic Design by Phillip, Meggs, and Alston, Purvis. In the 1950s, large corporations became aware of the need to develop a corporate image and identity amongst the public. Good design is good business was a phrase first mentioned by the IBM CEO. Design was recognized as a means to increase consumers' perception of quality, reliability, and value. Trademarks, of course, were nothing new, but the visual identity systems that began during this time, the 50s, were much more comprehensive. They encompassed all communications from a given organization into some kind of consistent design system. We're going to start off today with a few important designers who have had significant impact on the corporations that they worked for. We're going to start off mentioning Olivetti, the Italian manufacturer of computers and tablets, printers and business machines. But they started out making typewriters. This is the Valentine from 1969. Olivetti has had a long preoccupation with the importance of design. It seems to be part of their corporate philosophy, embracing everything from the shape of a space bar on a typewriter to the color of their products, and even their graphic design. Olivetti is the company who inspired IBM to initiate their own design program in the early 50s. In fact, that story is in our Looking Closer supplementary textbook, and an essay entitled Good Design is Good Business is written by Thomas Watson, the IBM CEO. This famous typewriter, called the Valentine, was designed by an Italian designer named Ettore Sottsass. Sottsass said it was, quote, designed to keep lonely poets company on weekends in the country. Olivetti realized that technical equipment can be domesticated, given a personality, a bit of a soul, so to speak. You do not have to treat it simply as a piece of anonymous machinery, but instead it could be understood as having a character of its own. I think the same thing was true of Apple Computer when they introduced their very colorful iMacs in 1998. This Valentine typewriters was just recently mentioned on Design Observer, that design blog I have recommended to you. Giovanni Pintori was hired by Mr. Olivetti in 1936 to work in what was called the publicity department. Giovanni Pintori was the creator of the Olivetti logo, together with many promotional posters and advertising that promoted the company and its products. This is from 1950. This one is from 1952, also designed by Pintori. It's interesting because it has this combination of a photograph together with kind of abstract representation of the process of typing on a keyboard. In 1952, the Museum of Modern Art held an exhibit titled Olivetti Design in Industry. And in fact, Olivetti products are still part of the museum's permanent collection. Olivetti, of course, paid attention to more than just product design. Their graphic and architectural design were also considered pivotal to the company. The posters that Pintori designed for Olivetti are really kind of abstract. There are allusions to recognizable imagery, but much of it is left up to your imagination. The use of abstract motifs in graphic design is not particularly common. Abstract motifs are an idea that can be used, however, to promote events, tell a story. You don't have to be visually explicit in order to make yourself understood, as Pintori has demonstrated. If we go back to the Bauhaus, you may remember the poster we saw by Just Schmidt, created for an exhibition at the Weimar in 1923, done while Schmidt was still a student. Except for the logo, which is a facial profile, the rest of the poster is really very abstract. The Bauhaus was moving at this time in a different direction, away from the handicraft where they started, to more of a machine aesthetic. Music is often inspiration for designers. We can jump up to 1998 and look at a poster created by the Swiss designer Nicholas Troxler, who personally founded and directed a jazz festival in his hometown in Switzerland, and has done so for nearly 40 years. In each of the posters that Troxler has designed for this festival, he has designed around a rather more abstract idea, creating geometric patterns, silhouettes, scribbles, splashes, translating his love for music into these more abstract ideas. Much like Pintori at Olivetti, and with a similar long-lasting influence, was the art director at CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, for almost 2 decades, a man named William Golden. The Photographic Eye, the CBS trademark that Golden designed, is acknowledged by most as one of the successful trademarks of the 20th century. I remember seeing an article in Time magazine on logos which referenced the CBS Eye. Interestingly, the president of CBS, named Frank Stanton, seemed to understand art and design and its potential in corporate affairs maybe better than the designer William Golden. Golden was ready to drop the logo he had designed after its first year, but the more perceptive Stanton said, "Just when you're beginning to get bored with what you have done is probably the time it is beginning to be noticed by your audience." That happens to be a quote that I have used for my own clients from time to time. Golden brought really a new level of artistry to the newspaper and trade advertising that he produced for CBS television in 1957. Golden would often commission painters to create illustrations for the CBS ads. You can see that the corporate identity for CBS is not terribly dictatorial. Rather, they rely just on the quality of each design to establish the identity. They will even drop the logo, as in this case here, if William Golden thought that it looked better without it. Here's a nice drawing by an illustrator, René Boucher, an ad created by William Golden in 1951. It's a newspaper ad for the CBS investigative reporter Edward R. Murrow, who had a kind of controversial program called See It Now. And in fact, that program and Edward R. Murrow were the subject of a 2005 movie, perhaps you've seen. It was called Good Night and Good Luck, directed by George Clooney. Interestingly, the New York Times said regarding the movie, good film, but shame about the typography. It appears that the CBS News sign, which was rather prominently displayed in the movie's carefully reconstructed newsroom, used the typeface Helvetica. But Helvetica was not designed until 1957, whereas this movie takes place in 1951 and 52. Apparently there are people who go around trying to figure out the inappropriate uses of typography in movies. William Golden wrote a looking closer essay titled Type is to be Read, where he said that intelligent design was the duty of a corporation, and that certainly is reflected in William Golden's attitude towards typeface and design for CBS. When Golden was visiting France, he found an old rendering of Didot typeface, which at the time was not available as a typeface. And he brought it back to New York and he gave it to his staff designers, which at the time included George Lois, the Esquire magazine cover designer, and Kurt Wiese. And he told Lois and Wiese to redraw the typeface suitable for reproduction. George Lois said, Bill was incredible. He took Didot, one of the most beautiful typefaces in the world, blew it up and said to Kurt and me, make it better. And every CBS letter in the world, Kurt and I redrew. We had to do a letter a week on top of our regular work. We complained, but we loved it. When William Golden passed away, Lou Dorfman, previously an art director at CBS Radio, became the creative director at CBS Television. And he continued the Golden tradition with no single philosophic style, but rather just an overall approach to problem solving and standards of visual organization. He did so right down to the numbers on wall clocks, elevator buttons, graphics that were part of the CBS building. I think it's interesting to look at the kind of signage you might see in inconspicuous places like an elevator, and note that even there, Lou Dorfman applied the CBS program of using Didot. Like Golden, Lou Dorfman also hired talented illustrators, in this case, Andy Warhol, before Andy made it big in the pop art world. A kind of direct, open presentation is typical of how Dorfman approached advertising for CBS. Another ad designed by Dorfman for a CBS program in 1968. A rather inventive use of the American flag. And here's a very elegant use of that Didot typeface. In the early 50s, when TV began to eat into the profits of radio, Lou Dorfman designed this promotional brochure for CBS Radio with an embossed ear on the cover. On the inside was an embossed radio microphone with the CBS initials on it. Lou Dorfman was appointed the director of design in 1964 and later on a corporate vice president in 1968, which seems to be in keeping with CBS management philosophy that design is an important area to be managed by professionals. This is a spread from a CBS book. It was on the voyage of the spaceship to the Earth and to the Moon and back, showing each stage in a very graphic representation. This is 1968. Here's some personal work by Lou Dorsman, a poster for a non-CBS event. This is 1980, back when the T-square was an important part of the tools of a graphic designer. One of the best-known industrial designers of the 20th century, but not someone was even mentioned in previous versions of our textbook, is Raymond Loewy, L-O-W-E-Y, born in France, but spent most of his professional career in the United States. He started out really as a fashion illustrator for Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, but is best known as an industrial designer. He really had a big influence on lots of aspects of North American culture. Among his many iconic contributions to modern life were locomotives for the Pennsylvania Railroad, cold spot refrigerators, coach for Greyhound bus system, and he approached many of these, particularly in the early part of his career, with a Art Deco streamlined style. You can see that represented in the shell of the locomotive. He worked on everything from pencil sharpeners to locomotives in a similar style. But Loewy also practiced graphic design. Interesting story about his conversation with the president of the American Tobacco Company, who wanted to boost sales to women in 1941. And he hired Loewy to improve the design, which had always used a red circle with type inside of it, but the president bet Raymond Loewy $50,000 that he couldn't improve sales simply by a redesign of the package. Loewy took him up on the offer. He made the package white, simplified the logo, put it on both the front and the back of the package, and launched it next year, and Loewy won the bet. More than 60 years after, the pack has hardly changed its design. Raymond Loewy had a long relationship with Studebaker automobiles, culminating in the design of the Avante, which became an instant classic when it hit the market. It has many devotees today, although many others consider the front-end styling really rather peculiar. This is 1963 Studebaker Avante. What Raymond Loewy called in the 1920s style engineering is what we would probably call today forced obsolescence. But no matter what you call it, the goal is to increase consumer interest and make products more stylish through modern design. Loewy tied this idea to consumer acceptability. He promoted what he called the Maya principle, M-A-Y-A. The designer should find solutions that are the most advanced yet acceptable, M-A-Y-A. This principle rejects the most very modern and austere, and yet promotes colors and shapes that give a sense of new and improved while not repelling a mass audience, which might be pushed off by something that's too modern, helping them to take just baby steps towards the very new. He created this chart in 1934. The New York World's Fair of 1939 to 40 was the epicenter of style engineering or forced obsolescence. It was both futuristic but acceptable. Modernism was just a bag of tricks that the designer could use to set an ordinary product apart, whether it be a car or a clock. Modernism offers the aura of avant-garde style without going too deep. Critics would, of course, argue that you are controlling consumer behavior, feeding the public new, enticing styles, but encouraging unnecessary spending and artificially stimulating growth. Loewy's chart on the previous slide was from 1934, but of course this continues today. Old is new, and new is made even newer. Sometimes we do old or retro to give a sense of history or heritage. Coca-Cola, in fact, has been great at this. One of the oldest brands in the world. It retains its logo and color and yet routinely alters its style, sometimes returning to the past and at other times switching gears to the future. The upper right-hand corner suggests the future. The bottom left-hand corner suggests the past. Coke has really followed Loewy's Maya principle, never being too avant-garde. Raymond Loewy did design a fountain dispenser for Coca-Cola. Loewy also designed the Exxon's logo. He had a long career that extended almost 70 years. He also did this for Shell in 1971. Much like Apple and Nike, Shell can just use the mark without any accompanying words spelling out Shell. The New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad began an impressive but kind of short-lived corporate identity program in 1954. A couple of the Bauhaus boys, Herbert Matter and Marcel Breuer, were commissioned to help the railroad. Matter designed a new trademark, a geometric capital N above an H, and a new red, black, and white color scheme. Marcel Breuer, the Bauhaus furniture designer, was commissioned to design both interiors and exteriors of the new train. Using Matter's color scheme and logo, Breuer designed a passenger train that looked almost like a Russian constructivist painting roaring down the track. However, design was not able to stop financial difficulties. The railroad went out of business in the late 50s. I gave a public lecture at Salt Lake Design Week about 6 years ago, which happened to be Paul Rand's 100th anniversary of his birth. There was a lot of publicity about Rand's legacy that year, and I capitalized on that for my lecture, and I have, in fact, incorporated it into this lecture. So we're going to go into a little more depth into how Rand became a real player in the development of corporate design in America beginning in the late 50s, which, as you recall, followed his beginnings in the design industry in advertising and editorial design back in the 40s. So Paul Rand designed the IBM logo based on the slab serif typeface City. He mentioned the difficulty he had in the selection of those three letters. Unfortunate that the first letter is a thin letter, an I. The next letter is a medium width, a B, and the last letter is a very wide M. And then how much better it'd be if, in fact, it was not in that progressively larger arrangement. Rand suggests that the subject matter of logos need not match the subject matter of the business. In other words, logos can look like whatever they want. They don't have to directly depict anything about the company they represent. Quote, surprising to many, the subject matter of a logo is of relatively little importance, and even appropriateness of content does not always play a significant role. This does not imply that appropriateness is undesirable. It merely indicates that a one-to-one relationship between a symbol and what it symbolized is very often impossible to achieve and, under certain conditions, objectionable. Ultimately, the only mandate is that the design of the logo, it seems, is that it be distinctive, memorable, and clear. So says Paul Rand. Rand added the scan lines to the IBM logo in 1960, about 4 years after he originated it in 56. The 8-line version and the 13-line version. The 8-line version is the IBM standard. He probably did it to lighten up the city bold typeface and or to create a mnemonic element, something that kind of lodges in your mind. They look much like the scan lines on an old TV set or old computer monitor. This is the packaging that Rand designed in the late 50s. Here using the earlier solid version of the logo without the scan lines. And you can see Rand here injecting things that are probably coming from his Matisse or Picasso-inspired graphic good vibrations into this IBM product line. This is the version that was introduced in 1973 and lasted till 84. It used the striped version of the logo. Rand had a long association with IBM, and so this packaging in 75 replaced the original Rand design from the 50s, which had lasted 2 decades. Saul Bass even used these kind of lines when he did the AT&T logo. Bass also used them for Minolta. We'll be talking more about Saul Bass in a few minutes. Scan lines became the corporate identity trope, it seems, of the 80s. And here's a book of optical illusions called The Book is a Seesaw, published in 1994. And you can see use of scan lines here on the cover of the book, kind of playing with your eyes and your mind all at the same time. So not only were Paul Rand's stripes influential, but also the design of his annual reports, which Rand suggested they could be used as a marketing tool. As a marketing tool, it contributes to the development of what is really a legal publication required by law, and made it into more of a corporate communications instrument. This is the cover, the inside front cover, and a spread from the 1958 annual report designed by Paul Rand. This is the beloved poster that Rand did for an IBM in-house event, designed in the latter part of his long-lasting relationship with IBM. But apparently the poster's meaning was a little lost on IBM because they refused to approve it, perhaps a little too playful for them when it was first proposed, but IBM has subsequently embraced it, and you find it on the IBM website now. Paul Rand's poster is a rebus, which comes from the Latin word meaning made by things. Rebuses have evolved to become a staple of modern conceptual design. Milton Glaser used it in 1977 for the New York State Department of Commerce in what has been a very iconic symbol for New York. Paul Rand's programs for organizations often run, not Paul Rand, but design programs for organizations often run the risk of deterioration as a result of responsibilities that have been placed in the hands of uninformed and changes in management. So the model developed by Paul Rand and IBM was to retain him as a design consultant, along with internal staff departments whose managers have authority for maintaining the corporate visual identity, but doing so under the direction of Rand or some other individual. This is the inside page of the IBM Design Guide, May of '72. The previous slide was the cover. Here's another page from that same document, and you can notice the reference to the Olivetti poster that started our lecture today. Here we talk about typeface options. And it also talks about what not to do. A standard component of any brand book. This is the Westinghouse logo designed by Paul Rand in 1960. The trademark symbolically incorporates the nature of the company and the business. Simple little devices that are memorable and direct and reference graphic forms that are associated with the industry that Westinghouse is in, wires and plugs, electric diagrams and circuitry, etc. Paul Rand said, "A logo derives meaning from the quality of the thing it symbolizes, not the other way around." Here's an ad created for Westinghouse, 1961. Paul Rand even signed it down in the bottom corner. This slide is a demonstration of Rand's dictum regarding the need for simplicity. You can probably recognize this easily despite it being very much out of focus. It's, of course, the trademark for ABC. He believed that to be functional for a long period of time, a trademark should be reduced to elementary shapes that are not only visually unique, but also universal and timeless. Sometimes you might wonder, do Rand's logos succeed merely because they are simple? Are they judged better just because they are ubiquitous and recognized very quickly? Today's trademark face greater performance expectation in today's screen-dominated culture that we live in currently. You could compare the ABC logo to NBC. NBC has that fluttering peacock or the CBS blinking eye, whereas Paul Rand's ABC logo is just a modernist bubble with some Bauhaus typography, very static. Paul Rand tells in one of his books that after coming up with the basic idea for the UPS mark, that he showed it to his then elementary age daughter, asking her what it was, and she said, "Well, it's a present, Daddy." Rand suggested that her comment was a validation of the logo's simple, communicative power. There was a lot of controversy in the design community after the 2003 redesign of the UPS logo. It's one of the very few of Rand's classic identities that has been redesigned, not only because of Rand, but also it uses a lot of cliches that designers typically dislike. It has dimensional lettering, and it has those faux metallic reflections. Michael Beirut called the redesign of the UPS logo the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger Photoshop Fantasy, or the Golden Comb-Over. Despite that, Michael Beirut, in his Dare to Criticize Rand article titled The Sins of St. Paul, he said that it didn't mean that the UPS logo wasn't flawed or overdue for a change. Beirut mentioned the fact that the UPS logo won't even allow you to tie a package with string anymore, like Rand's logo had suggested. So Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple Computer, the company that he co-founded in the late 80s, and he started an educational computer company called Next. By the late 80s, Silicon Valley was full of lots of new tech startups, and the majority of those young corporations were hiring equally young designers. But Steve Jobs thought differently, to use an appropriate phrase for Apple. Jobs said, "I think Paul understands the purpose and power of logos better than anyone in history," referring to Paul Rand. Rand had to get permission from IBM, from whom he consulted, to see if it was okay that he work with Steve Jobs at Next Computer. So Paul Rand's compensation has entered somewhat into graphic design mythology. He apparently got $100,000 for a one-off, take-it-or-leave-it logo proposal in 1986. It'd be more than 2 times that amount in today's dollars. Paul Rand said, "When somebody pays me a lot of money, he's not doing so because he likes to. He pays me because that is what I deserve." "What is the fee measured on?" Rand said. "It's measured on nothing. If it takes me an hour, I do it in an hour. If it takes me a year, it takes a year. I don't work on time. You give me the problem, I let the idea come. Most of the time, it's immediate. I don't start making sketches that can throw you." I think we've already commented on Rand's humility, or perhaps lack thereof. Interestingly, Paul Rand doesn't come across that way in person. There is an interesting video available on YouTube that I suggest you look up that shows Paul Rand presenting his logo to Steve Jobs, and he appears there much more like a lovable grandfather. As is typical of Apple today, Paul Rand was given very little to design his logo for Next Computer. What little information he had was only alluded to very much as part of the positioning of the company, which was the Next Computer for Educational Design. Rand knew that the Next Computer was to be contained in a black cube. However, the public didn't know that when the logo was introduced. I've long believed that the success of a designer depends significantly on his ability to sell, maybe more so than his ability even as a designer. So I've been fascinated with the approach that Paul Rand took to deal with the outsized personality of Steve Jobs. Rand's approach to sell the work was unique in 2 ways. One, he presented only one logo, which underscores his confidence in the solution and deflects any indecision on the part of his client. And 2, he only speaks through a presentation booklet. In this case, it was titled "The Sign of the Next Generation of Computers for Education." The booklet explained the rationale and showed the application of the logo. At the presentation, Rand apparently did not utter a word. He just sat quietly as Steve Jobs read this little booklet. There are some conflicting reports, one of which says that Rand waited in his hotel room for Jobs' response. Another report says the presentation was occurred at Jobs' house with Paul Rand present, but in either case, the booklet did the talking. Set in Caslin, Paul Rand starts right off with the premise of the booklet. What should a logo for Next look like? He condenses decades of communication history into just a couple minutes of reading time. He says, choosing typeface as the basis for the design of a logo is a convenient starting point. Here are two examples, Caslon and Beaver. Caslon is an alphabet designed as far back as 1723 by William Caslon. It appears to be a good choice because it is both elegant and bookish, qualities which are well suited for educational purposes. Rand then goes on to diffuse the client's desire to sample a variety of typefaces. One reason for looking at a number of possible typefaces is to satisfy one's curiosity. Another, and perhaps more meaningful one, is to study the relationship of different visual analogies and to try to elicit ideas that the design of a letter or group of letters might inspire. Then sets it in all caps and explains why this doesn't work. Set in all capitals, the word next is sometimes confused with exit, possibly because the EXT grouping is so dominant. A combination of capitals and lowercase letters alleviates this problem. Here are some possibilities which explore the use of lowercase letters. The E is differentiated as to provide the capital letters which otherwise consist only of straight lines. Happily, the E could also stand for education, excellence, expertise, exceptional, excitement, E equals MC squared, etc. I personally think Rand is stretching the bit if he's getting to E equals MC squared, but nonetheless. He goes on to talk about how a logo should function. Quote, ideally, a logo should explain or suggest the business it symbolizes, but this is rarely possible or even necessary. There is nothing about the IBM symbol, for example, that suggests computers except what the viewer reads into it. Stripes are now associated with computers because the initials of a great company happens to be striped. A logo takes on meaning only if it, over a period of time, is linked to some product or service or a particular organization. What is essential is finding a meaningful device, some idea, preferably product-related, that reinforces the company name. The cube in which the computer will be housed can be such a device because it has visual impact and it is easy to remember. Unlike the word next, it is depictable, possesses the power of meaning and the pleasure of recognition. So Rand describes the structure of the logo. Splitting the logo into two lines accomplishes several things. It startles the viewer and gives the word a new look, thus making it easier to separate from common usage. And even more importantly, it increases the letter size twofold within the framework of the cube. For small space, a one-line logo would have been too small to fit within the same framework. He then presents it in color, presents it in different sizes, and in application. In a sort of cosmic irony, the last corporate logo designed by Rand before he died in 1996 was for Enron Corporation. Took the form of a square balanced on one corner, simple and bold. But you might be aware that in 2002, Enron collapsed due to an enormous accounting fraud that became known as the Enron Scandal. Enron has since become a popular symbol of willful corporate fraud and corruption. Rand was inducted into the Art Directors Hall of Fame. He received the AIGA Medal, the highest honor of the organization. His position on the faculty at the Yale School of Art was 35 years long. All the awards and accolades that would establish him as this country's greatest graphic designer by the time he died in 1996. Rand, of course, is not without his faults and critics. During Rand's later career, he became increasingly agitated about the rise of postmodernist theory and aesthetics in design. We'll be talking about postmodernist theories in a week or two. Accusations of Rand being reactionary and hostile to new ideas about design came about. In 92, Rand resigned his position at Yale in protest of the appointment of a postmodern and feminist designer named Sheila Levrant to Bretteville. And he even convinced his colleague Armand Hoffman to do the same thing. In justification of his resignation from Yale, Rand wrote an article, "Confusion and Chaos, the Seduction of Contemporary Graphic Design," in which he denounced the postmodern movement as faddish and frivolous and harboring its own boredom. Michael Beirut wrote on Design Observer an article titled "The Sins of St. Paul." He said that Rand had a single-minded emphasis on logos, and he had too little interest in the outside and not the inside. Paid too little attention to the content of the things that he worked on. His annual reports are not the visual storytelling of good communications. He was dedicated to the timelessness, but it drove him repeatedly to the purity of form without content. He also said that Rand was a bit humorless. He said just because he used cut paper and primary colors doesn't mean that Rand has a childlike sense of wonder. And Beirut said his famous Rebus IBM poster seemed to Beirut to be waiting for its punchline. Regardless of these disputes, Rand's contribution to modern graphic design theory in total has widely made him the intrinsic hero to the profession's development. This is the work of Lester Beale, who we talked about as one of the few designers of the American modern movement during the Depression. We saw Lester Beale's rural electrification administration posters a week or two ago. He did pioneering work in corporate identity as well during the last 2 decades of his life. This is the logo for International Paper. It was somewhat controversial in the design community at first. Critics questioned whether or not the letterform should be altered to this extreme. It is, of course, a tree, but also a I and a P within that circle. Lester Beale blazed the trail in development of corporate identification manuals along with Paul Rand. This is a page from his manual for International Paper. The scope of an organization like International Paper is difficult to control. They have far-flung facilities, and yet they required consistency in the design of everything from vehicles to signs to business cards and invoices, and yet that sometimes is difficult when a company has offices spread all over the place. This has nothing to do with Lester Beale, but it is an interesting jump to the 1990s to see how far corporate identity manuals have come. Even an anti-establishment company like Harley-Davidson requires some effort to maintain their rebel image. So here are instructions on how to keep that look. What Harley-Davidson recognizes is that it must be able to negotiate between the different cultures that the company serves. You indeed have anti-establishment bikers, but you also have investment bankers. Although even rebellious, Harley-Davidson needs communication guidelines, although the skull and crossbones behind the forbidden logos here do leave a little sense of humor. We've mentioned Shemaev and Gizmar in the last lecture. You probably recognize who this logo is. Chase. The logo is an abstract form. It has no alphabetical, no pictographic, no figurative connotations, and yet it has become very important in the world of corporate identification. It's recognized the world over. It's part of a comprehensive visual image program that Shemaev and Gizmar did for Chase Manhattan Bank. They designed a distinctive sans-serif typeface for use with the logo. When Chase Manhattan Bank was deregulated, together with all banks, Chase Manhattan was able to merge and acquired with other banks and became a national bank, dropping the Manhattan but retaining the mark. The Chase mark has gained rapid recognition value, proving that successful logos can become just another character in the inventory of symbolic forms that every person carries around with them in their head. The Chase logo is much like a dollar sign or an and symbol. Even though it doesn't have recognizable elements, you still associate it with the bank because it has had so much repetition. Steve Jobs later said, "The book itself was a big surprise. Shemaev and Gizmar has produced over 100 different corporate identity programs. One of the more interesting was the upper right-hand corner for Time Warner. Consolidation in the 1980s between Warner Communications, who took over Time Incorporated. It combined the flashy West Coast style of Warner with the Ivy League East Coast tradition of Time. It didn't last. Warner spun off Time just a year or two ago. Apparently there was too much difficulty in the magazine publishing business, even though Time owns People and Sports Illustrated and other magazines. The icon that Shemaev and Gizmar came up with for the combined Time Warner was a schematic eye with a spiraling interpretation of an ear. The designer said at the time, Warner is primarily entertainment, while Time is essentially journalism. So a common denominator needed to be much broader, looking and listening, reading and hearing, receiving and sending. But just after 3 years, it was replaced by just typesetting. Apparently a little too strong a statement for such a vast conglomerate with such different brands. It was, however, adopted by a cable company. There doesn't seem to be any office style at Shemaev and Gizmar. Solutions evolving from the problem at hand. This is a poster by Shemaev for Mobil Oil, 1972. Another poster by Shemaev called The Invisible City, same year. In addition to corporate identity design, at least until their recent retirement, the company continued to do small projects. This is a magazine cover done in 1979. The office is involved with exhibition design and even has an architect on staff. This magazine cover is typical of Shemaev's particular collage style, taping together different elements. I've seen it done before. So we talked about Saul Bass in regards to his long activity in the movie business. But in the latter part of his career, he was involved in trademark design, more so than film graphics. This is an example, at least the bottom right-hand corner, of Saul Bass's evolution in trademark design as applied to Quaker Oats. Before the breakup by the Federal Trade Communication, the corporate identification program designed by Saul Bass was reputed to be the most expensive ever. This is for the Bell telephone system. At one time, the Bell telephone system was the only telephone company in the United States. They not only provided service from coast to coast, but they also owned even the telephones themselves. 2 years after Saul Bass designed the Bell telephone system trademark, it was recognized by 90% of the public as the trademark for that company. After the Bell system broke up, Saul Bass also did AT&T's logo, the largest of the broken up companies, applying his experience in the movie making business. He demonstrated how the new logo could be used in a electronic medium, suggesting that they were a globe of circling bits of information that transforms itself into the trademark. AT&T ended up merging with Singular a few years ago. AT&T was the more well-known name, kept the equity there, kept the symbol but redesigned other parts of it, used lowercase letters. I don't know if you remember the Singular logo, but I thought that they had a more interesting logo than anybody at the time of the mobile telephone companies. Finally, we did get rid of the awful Verizon logo. It was designed by Michael Beirut at Pentagram. But in regards to AT&T, the redesign was commented on Design Observer. One commenter suggested we had to fight the loss of these historic, iconic logos. He said we need to fight it the same way that we fight the loss of historic buildings. It's a nice sentiment, but I don't think it's going to fly in the corporate world. Just the year before last, the logo again has been updated, this time by a company called Interbrand, subtly changing the relationship between the blue and the white areas of the symbol. At Brand New, another design blog, the editor there at Brand New is named Armin Witt, and he said in regards to the new logo redesigned by Interbrand, he said, for us designers, both the 2005 and this newer version of the logo aren't so much AT&T's new logo as they are not Saul Bass AT&T logo, which we've placed in such high pedestal that the air pressure changes up there. We'll always compare any updates to this logo back to the original, not because it was a perfect logo, but it serves as a touch point in the development of logo and corporate identity design by one of our heroes. So the Interbrand design went back to all caps, but Armin Witt went on to say in his criticism Mainstream consumers don't give a shit, of course, and good for them because they can just focus on whether the service is good or not moan every time a bill comes in the mail with that shady globe logo. Saul Bass said the logo needs elements of metaphor and ambiguity to be successful. I don't know if you recognize this logo because it has now been replaced. It's for United Airlines, who merged with Continental Airlines in 2010. They discarded Bass's logo and kept Continental's. Logos like those of Paul Rands and Saul Bass symbolize the rising importance of the graphic design profession, but it's interesting to see what happens sometimes. Prudential Insurance Company's original logo, designed from 1896, was replaced by something much more modern, but it didn't last. In 1989, they changed it to something in between its original and its most recent. In 1974, the United States government initiated the Federal Design Improvement Program, which is coordinated by the National Endowment for the Arts. The Graphics Improvement Program set forth to improve the quality of visual communications and the ability of government agencies to communicate with its citizenry. The very first graphic standard system for any federal agency was done for the Department of Labor. It was developed by John Massey at the Center for Advanced Research and Design, which happened to be a subsidiary of Container Corporation of America, who we've talked about. So the Department of Labor logo uses stripes, which reference the American flag, stars and stripes. Besides the logo itself, the establishment of standards for formats, including sizes, typography, grid systems, paper specifications, colors, was an attempt to realize some standardized economies of scale, material, and time, so that Department of Labor staff designers were able to devote more time to creative aspects and less time to just redesigning the wheel every time. The National Park Service was also part of the Federal Design Improvement Program when they implemented the Unigrid system in 1977, an attempt to unify the informational brochures that were handed out at over 350 different park locations. Each of these brochures had a similar need. They all had a sitemap, information about the park. The Unigrid was a system, a format, a prototype for all of these publications. The format was implemented by other designers, together with writers and photographers, so they needed a standardized system of sizes, a very flexible grid. It had a identification up the top in black, reversed out of black, with the name of the park and limited range of typefaces and sizes. The same format was even used for books. The result has been a consistent level of quality, together with a strong visual identity and financial savings due to the standardization of elements in the National Park Service. I was in New York City a few years ago and took these photos at the Museum of Modern Art of the MTA display, the Metropolitan Transit Authority of New York. These displays were honoring the work of Massimo Vignelli and his Unimark partner, Bob Noorda. Vignelli and Unimark designed the signage system for the iconic subway system in New York City. The signs have become part of the fabric of the city, really seen and read by millions of riders every day. I think when many people picture New York City in their mind, these signs pop up. The loose leaf binder that is shown on display at the Museum of Modern Art is right underneath the map. That, in fact, is my wife, looking at the manual, probably wondering how designers can get so excited about these things. But that loose leaf binder is the subway system standards manual for the Metropolitan Transit Authority. The signage project began with an analysis of traffic flow to identify points of decision and levels of information. Interestingly, just 2 years ago, the manual was republished as a hardcover book on a Kickstarter campaign after it was discovered in the basement of Pentagram in New York City. In fact, 2 of my employees bought a copy of the book. It was coincidental that it just happened to be the same year that Vignelli passed away. The Kickstarter organizers were all 20-somethings, and they said, quote, "I think for graphic designers, the manual is kind of the Rosetta Stone, Swiss-style modernist design, and in particular, Vignelli's work has been fetishized in recent years, especially by my generation of designers. I'm the first to admit guilt here. There's no denying it's an intoxicating book of pure graphic design porn." In the manual, different sign combinations were detailed to show how a strictly minimal system could be adapted to the complex problems that is the New York City subway. Behind the stark modernist graphics and typography lies a thorough, logical analysis of the subway system that has informed the system signage even to this day. The standards manual was built for analog implementation, not the modern digital era that we live in now. The book was literally meant to be used for reproduction. Paint chips were perforated and attached. Artwork is sized correctly for photo reproduction. Today, of course, that's all prescribed digitally and often in a corporate identity PDF. Every possible letter combination was considered. The spacing that must be allowed between each letter specified. The level of fastidious detail was a hallmark of Noorda and Vignelli's work. The biggest difference with this manual is the amount of theory and logical analysis that was included. Many pages are dedicated to the information design of the subway rider experience. Vignelli and Noorda didn't just make some old signs look nice. They tried to design the total experience for the subway rider. This is a calendar designed by Massimo in 1966. Hasn't changed at all since its original publication. I've been buying this calendar. It's called the Stendig calendar for 30 years at my office. That's an old employee of mine, Russ Gray, peeking over our office furniture, sitting in front of the calendar. It's large. It's 3 feet by 4 feet, easily visible from across the office. Has lots of impact. By the end of the same year it was designed, it was already in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Visual interest comes from the flush left instead of flush right, tightly spaced type. Flush left, of course, is standard for Swiss style, but not for calendars, which are almost always flush right. The treatment of the weekday letters in the same size as the numbers is also unique. It does catch people off guard with a week beginning on Monday instead of Sunday. The furniture maker Knoll, long known for their quality furniture design, was a client of Vignelli and Associates, so the graphic program signified a strong design orientation. Vignelli left Unimark in 1971 to head a multidisciplinary firm in New York, together with his wife, Lella, an architect. You can see some similarities in this program for the IDCNY with the park system brochures. Although no longer strictly using Helvetica, Vignelli does believe in using only 5 classical faces: Helvetica, Futura, Garamond, Century Expanded, and Bedoni. Michael Beirut, now a partner at Pentagram, was in charge of graphic design for many years at Vignelli. He tells a story that after he departed Vignelli, he was now free to use any typeface he wanted. He showed one of his new design solutions to his wife, who said, noting his typeface use, "You've really become a typographic whore, haven't you?" This is one of Michael Beirut's designs while he was working at Vignelli. It was a lecture for a British architect, plays with the compositions of both classical and primary elements, hand-drawn scribble contrasting with the otherwise more formal layout. In 1971, Vignelli was commissioned to design a map for the New York subway system. Vignelli originally proposed an iterated system of many maps. In addition to an overall map, they wanted neighborhood maps, pocket maps, verbal or audio maps. But only the pocket map and the overall system map were ever produced. Vignelli followed the same map diagram philosophy as Becker had done for the London Underground many years before. There's an underlying grid organizing railways into vertical, horizontal, and 45-degree angles. Each line had a different color with a number and letter designation. Every station was listed, but a dot on the line indicated a stop. No dot, no stop. Like Becker's original map, it was distorted, with the central, more congested areas larger than the outlying areas. Vignelli used layering, separations, and color to help differentiate different planes of information. Clarified was what was important to the clarification what was important to the traveler, how to get from point A to point B. It bypassed the literal and focused instead on relationships, while all the time maintaining modernist design principles. Soon after the system map was put into place, the official who had hired Vignelli retired, and his replacement criticized the map. He said it lacked reference to the natural geography. In fact, the water wasn't blue, and the parks weren't green, and Central Park was not really a square. So it didn't last. It was replaced about 8 years after its introduction. Vignelli was vindicated somewhat when, in 1972, he was asked to design an online version. And the design of the original was probably well suited for online accessibility. Although they didn't call it a map, they called it a subway diagram. Vignelli Associates is a multidisciplinary firm. They do not only graphic design, but they do interior design, product, and furniture design. Lella heads up the branch of the firm responsible for product and furniture design. Vignelli & Associates did a line of stackable plastic dinnerware in 1967. The concept was to make a compact set of edge wall interlocking units that would give safe space and achieve a clean shape as a final result. They came in a range of bright colors, and the first argument my wife and I ever had when we were married was what dinnerware we were going to buy. This is what I wanted: Heller stacking dinnerware. My wife had other ideas. We did end up buying both, the more traditional as well as this. My daughter also bought some of this same dinnerware, and to my surprise, bought us a new set of Heller stacking dinnerware just about 7 or 8 years ago after our original was pretty much beat up. Outside the Department of Labor and the National Park Service, one of the only other graphical achievements of the Federal Design Improvement Program was the modernist mark known as the worm for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. The abstracted A used in the word NASA represents the minimalist cones that can metaphorically suggest rockets taking off. The result was a very modern, flowing, continuous design that works great in space and on television. This is the standards manual for the publication. But unfortunately, in 1992, the NASA chief decided to return to the romantic trademark of 1959, known at NASA as the Meatball Logo. To the NASA CEO, the older logo represented the golden days of the organization before the unfortunate Challenger disaster. When the logo was reintroduced, he said, "The magic is back." The Graphic Standards Manual is another one that's being reprinted and made available. When you think about it, though, maybe the NASA battle over the modernist worm should not surprise us as designers. That's exactly what designers do for themselves sometimes. This is the exhibition poster designed by Charles Spencer Anderson. We'll be talking about him in detail in a couple of weeks, but for years, Charles Spencer Anderson has built a reputation on nostalgic design that's not very different from the NASA Meatball Logo. Landor redesigned Federal Express, taking advantage of what everyone called them, FedEx. You're probably familiar with the subliminal arrow that's hidden inside the E and the X. An enterprising designer in New York took advantage of the power of corporate identities when he took a number of well-known logos and used them as flyers for the promotion of a New York band named Lotion. And humorously, in 1975, Jerry Herring, a Texas designer, got a laugh with a flyer promoting stock trademarks. He said, "Are you in need of a dynamic new image? But are you hesitant because of the expense and the uncertainty of selecting a logo? All these designs are available in black, green, or blue. A few are available in red. Allow 2 to 3 weeks for delivery." Tree trademarks are good for real estate projects. Goes real well with woodsy names like Oakmont or Pine Sap. The arrow trademark for companies on the move, on the way up or on the go, specify whether going straight up or to the right. Funny as it is, in 1975, it's come all too true. In the 2020, I've seen, as maybe you've seen, emails from companies that sell pre-made logos or $49.95. All you do is take the AI file and change the words company name to your company name, and you're off and running with your new company logo for only $49. In airports, international travelers are often challenged with unique problems because they are, in fact, coming from other areas that don't necessarily speak the language of their country in which their airport is located. And so graphic designers have often been commissioned to create some sort of pictographic solution as part of a signage program to communicate information and directions. Recognizing this problem and some need for standardization and the ongoing duplication of effort, the U.S. Department of Transportation commissioned the AIGA to create a master set of some 34 symbols for use in transportation facilities. These symbols were designed and drawn by Cook and Chanisky Associates. Their object was clarity of image, and their underlying goal was overall harmony achieved with consistency between lines and shapes, weights, and forms. Similar problems present themselves at events like the Olympics. Comprehensive design systems for large organizations or events are necessary when large numbers of people are involved, particularly if international and multilingual. Such is the case with the Mexico Olympics in 1968, and it's noted for a very comprehensive and creative solution designed by an American, Lance Wyman, who was appointed the director of design. Wyman determined that the solution should reflect the cultural heritage of Mexico and not the design tastes of New York or Basel, Switzerland. So after extensive studies, Lance Wyman determined that multiple repeated lines, which formed patterns, reflected the Mexican heritage. 5 Olympic rings merged with the year 68 with the word Mexico in a new custom typeface. He also produced matching graphics for events, sites, all in a modular format. These are the tickets. You can see the custom typeface and photograms of the events. This is a collection of stamps where the silhouetted athletes are printed over brilliant color backgrounds. The images are designed to flow from one stamp to another continuously. Lance Wyman was in Salt Lake City just 2 years ago and spoke at Salt Lake Design Week. And I had the privilege, together with Dan Evans, to go to lunch with Lance Wyman, and we talked about the Mexico 68 Olympics. Not surprisingly, in 1972, the Olympics in Munich, Germany, used the International Typographic Style, or Swiss style. The system that was devised used a spiraling logo, 2 vertical hairlines, and the universe typeface. He limited the range of colors. In fact, no red was allowed. The design system was by Otto Eicher, A-I-C-H-E-R. Eicher and his staff created all of the details that would guide designers, no matter who was implementing the specifics. He had not only a grid system for brochures, but also for pictographs, with enough complexity to allow an infinite range of possibilities. The pictographs would sometimes serve not only as signifiers, but also as illustrations. The ticket, 1972 Olympics. A really large variety can be achieved with a consistent format. In number 6, the grid became part of the illustration itself. There was an exhibition of the 1972 Olympic graphics in San Jose State University in 2008. It really shows the strength of this work of Otto Eicher. You can see the format, the color, the grid, all of the hallmarks of the International Typographic System. You can see it on display in this exhibit. You can see how the limited range of colors formats it. The absence of red. This is the directional signage for the Montreal 1976 Olympics. In 1984, the Olympics were held in Los Angeles, and an environmental and graphic design firm known as Sussman Preza and Company established and directed the vocabulary of the 84 Olympics. The design parameters allowed for diversity, but within a fixed range of possibilities. Many designers worked on the enormous project, but all used the parameters established by Sussman Preza, the colors, the typefaces, the style. This is the entrance to the Los Angeles swimming competition venue. They took inexpensive cardboard cylinders, painted them, used them at the introduction to different venues. These are the pictograms for the 84 Olympics. These are the pictograms for the 1992 Olympics in Albertville. Some thought that Lillehammer in 94 stole what would have been appropriate for Salt Lake City pictograms that somehow looked like they related to southern Utah pictograms. As if you think that all Olympics are incredibly great design, I'm showing you an example of the Lake Placid Olympics in 1980. Not only do we have this kind of awkward, unbalanced symbol, at least in my opinion, a dark navy blue and black, but a really strange combination of type. We got Helvetica together with Optima in a very similar weight. And if that's not bad enough, this is their pictograms. They look like they're for the Disney Olympics. This was the bid book for Salt Lake's attempt to land the Olympics. The logo and book were designed by Ted Nagata, now a retired designer. But he did a lot of nice work around Salt Lake City, including the snowbird logo that is still in use. But the actual logo for the Salt Lake Olympics was designed by Landor, the same firm that had designed the FedEx logo. They're out of San Francisco. They did it together with a local advertising agency partner named Evans Advertising. I like the design of the 2002 Salt Lake logo. It uses Gill Sans, the typeface designed by Eric Gill. It was interesting that shortly after the Landor and Evans Advertising were awarded the job, they paid a select group of local designers and design firms to sit around for an afternoon and talk about the visual direction of the Salt Lake Olympics. I was invited to that meeting, and it was said that we were going to be the ones that would in fact be the primary consulting designers for executing the designs for the 2002 Olympics in our city. However, as it turned out, that didn't happen. Unlike nearly every other Olympics, the Salt Lake Olympics decided to hire designers short term. They put together a large staff of designers that worked for the Salt Lake Olympics until the Olympics are over. And as a result, all of the designers and design firms in the city did not have an opportunity to work with them unless, in fact, they were hired as employees at the organization. We're going to end up here with the Mtv logo, something you're probably familiar with, designed by Manhattan Design in 1981. The interesting thing about the Mtv logo is its ability to change its look and nature and disassemble it, meld it, shatter it without losing its ability to verify its identity. We'll end there. Thank you. It'd still be very recognizable. No matter what you do it, you could, in fact, the grid system for the national parks was designed by Massimo Vignelli. He passed away in 2014 with a bit of sadness and acclamation from the world graphic design community. The national park system was designed when Vignelli was a partner in Unimark, a design firm in Chicago. And in fact, the design system for the National Park Service was called the Unigrid. Unimark was a large international design firm. Massimo Vignelli had moved from Italy in 1965. He was trained as an architect, and he co-founded Unimark with Bob Noorda, a Dutch graphic designer. The life of the firm was relatively short-lived, but it was at the time the largest design firm in the world, and it had a major influence on the direction of American design aesthetics. The style and aesthetics of the Unimark Group grew out of the international typographic style. They completed programs for J.C. Penney, Panasonic, Memorex, American Airlines, although that was changed a couple of years ago. But if you think about those companies, Penny's, Panasonic, Memorex, you might recognize that all of them still use Helvetica. Some design firms have been criticized for peddling the same solution with just minor tweaks for completely different problems. I suspect that all of the companies that walked through the door of Saul Bass and Associates had a different problem at first, and yet they all seemed to leave with something very similar, a curved edge, stylized, centered logo hovering above a white space and a quasi-modernist sans serif type underneath it. Makes you wonder. Convinced that each typographic example on the first few pages was the final logo. I was never quite sure what Paul was doing until I reached the end. But at that moment, I knew we had our solution. Rand gave us a jewel. Next was a failure, however. The best logo in the world won't help if no one wants your product. Apple bought Next, which by that time was software only. The software bought by Apple became the basis for OX10, but it did bring back Steve Jobs as CEO, and Apple seems to have been on a run ever since.